Okay, so this week we read another Stuart Hall piece, which hopefully was a little easier to grasp because you had had a previous Stuart Hall piece. What were your feelings about his representation language piece? Any thoughts? Did you find it impenetrable or difficult? A little bit of background, right, is he spends a lot of time in that essay talking about language. And I think it's easy to get lost in the weeds there. Did anybody feel that way? He's talking about language. Did y'all read it? Being honest with me?
So,
Yeah.
um, so I skimmed through it as
Hmm.
well, but so you saying how representation of languages, like in films and stuff, if I'm correct, before so I get what he's saying because I see like a lot of movies or
Hmm.
shows out there that kind of do some scenes or some sets where a specific scene will require like someone to speak a foreign language, and like people that are actually native speakers to that language will say, hey, that doesn't sound like our language.
Hmm.
Your accent is kind of off, and stuff like that, and like you could
Yeah.
tell that sometimes the producer or the director of that
Yeah. You just dropped off. I
set
don't know
doesn't
something
do their
happened.
research.
Yeah,
Doesn't.
for sure. Um, what I will say is that's a very good brief example of one type of how like what he's talking about with language that turns into literal representation. The reason he spends so much time talking about language is because representational theory, as Stuart Hall conceives of it, comes from semiotic theory, which is a linguistic theory of how we process mental ideas about objects primarily, right? So the idea that when we see a photograph of a tree, we actually interpret it three different ways. We see it as this is a tree, it's a representation of a tree, and then also there is a meaning that we might associate with that tree in that context, right? Whether it, like an avatar, the tree of life, right, has a very specific connotation when we see it within the context of the film that affects our understanding of its kind of symbolic meaning. The iconic image of the tree we understand as just tree, while the indexical is like that is not a real tree. It is, uh, a resemblance, something that is related to a tree. Okay, so that's what they're getting at here. It's semiotics, semiology. If you've taken film theory, you've got a little bit of background in that. Hopefully, somebody did that work for you.
Um,
Yeah,
can I
go
say
ahead.
something? I'm actually in film and theory
Mhm.
criticism right now, and I actually just had to do an analysis on the representation on like a window frame or whatever. So when
Yeah,
you
yeah,
gave the example of the tree, in my essay or whatever, I talked about how like the perception is limited to the visual dimension of the viewers that are
yeah.
constantly trying to process what they're perceiving. So that's kind of what I got out of this
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, and if you think back to the Stuart Hall piece we read, the encoding and decoding piece, right? Everybody remembers this from just a little bit back. Um, if you remember that, what he's talking about there is how we create meanings at both the input and the output process of generating culture or media production, right? Um, the same idea applies here. Okay, he's thinking through how representations are created and how we interpret those representations. And the reason that linguistic theory for him is so important is not only does it give us this kind of like semiotic understanding of how images function and how we relate certain concepts of what those images mean in ourselves, but it also functions as kind of like, the reason that those signs even make sense to us is because on some level, culturally, we understand them to be the same thing. And language functions literally that way, right? So that, to return to Anthony's point about kind of just in films, even where there might be scenes of people speaking a foreign language and native speakers saying, like, that's not right, or that accent's off, or they're actually saying this, but the subtitle says this, or whatever. The reason that we understand and can interpret films made in Hollywood, mostly by, white, usually Christian slash Jewish filmmakers, usually men, is because we all speak English, on some level, and or we all live in a culture where, patriarchal white masculinity kind of exists as a default, and therefore we share a common understanding of culture in that way. Does everybody see what he's getting at here? So, like, if we're just thinking about language, and that's what he spends, like, I think too long on in this section writing about, his main point is that the reason that we know what somebody says when they say tree is because we also understand what tree means in English, conceptually as well as literally. Do we get that? Everybody's on board?
Yeah, so basically you're saying that like a meaning is produced through the language, whether like, so for instance, if someone speaks French,
Mhm.
you might not understand what they're saying, but then again, if they give you like the directional sign that we have, you would be able to understand it.
Yeah, for sure. And also, right, so it's not just the language, it's also the system within which the language participates, right? So if you speak a foreign language and then you go to a different country where that language is also spoken, the language might have different systems of grammar, or it might be like a patois or a Creole, right? And so, even though the words are often the same, sometimes the meanings are different based on how they're arranged by the people within that specific culture, right? And so, that's what he's talking about when he thinks about representation and how meaning is created. We have to think about the who and the what. So, who is creating, and what are the contexts within which it is being created in order for us to understand the representational aspect of media. We got that? I know Destiny has it because she's responded. Anybody else? Thumbs up? Okay, cool. Y'all just give me some sign of life. I don't need to, hear you or see you necessarily, but some engagement's good. Okay. So that's really kind of Stuart Hall's key concepts. And if you watched the explainer video, which I gave y'all because, even though it's another white dude explaining what the theory means to you, at least it's not just you watching nonstop videos of me telling you what Stuart Hall is getting at. I think the more important thing for us to think through is how that theory of representation and thinking through who is creating representation and how we understand that representation, we need to think through, like, how do we use this theory as something that we can create something with, or that can generate our own ideas and understanding of the world. Okay, so before we get into Kristen Warner's piece on plastic representation, what are some common ways you understand representational politics related to media production, or film culture, or television, or video game industry, anything like that? Anybody have an example of what we might think of in different ways as representation? I'm going to pull up one, but does anybody want to put something in chat?
I guess an example could be like the movie Avatar, how the tree of life, only because you said something about a tree earlier again. It overall represents, like you said, the tree of life and what they went through to overall, fight to keep their land. What that meant to them, those people. What it meant to the overall people that were trying to take the tree down was it's just money. You see what I'm saying? So
Mhm.
that's really the only thing I can think of.
What are some popular campaigns and things like that that have argued for better representation in film or television production?
I honestly wouldn't have a clue.
No clue. Let's see. Sawyer back here, Avatar: The Last Airbender having a lot of Asiatic and Asian cultural representation. Um, Black Lives Matter, right, is creating a very broad sense of visibility within culture more generally, not just media, but that is a representational movement. The hashtag Oscars so white. So you are familiar with, right, like what are the goals of these representational movements mostly? Like what is the goal of Oscars so white as a hashtag? Why did that become a thing, and what do they want to happen as a result of bringing awareness to it?
Wasn't it about, it was calling to attention the fact that there were so little um, people of color being nominated for awards, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera too, in all aspects of the filmmaking process. And I think the goal of it was, of course, to correct that. So to, bring to light, the fact that most of the films that were being nominated, the best parts of it were being done by, people of color. Like I remember there was a joke on SNL, like a little skit, about how most of the nominees were for films that featured Black or brown people in the film. So like I think Straight Outta Compton, like Paul Giamatti got nominated for like a supporting role when the
Right.
whole movie was about NWA. And
Yep.
you could have, and they left out, I'm forgetting everybody's name except for Ice Cube's son who played Ice Cube, but that there were literally like 3 actors off the top who could have done something. And then I think wasn't Sylvester Stallone nominated for something for the Creed movie
For
that
Creed.
starred Michael B. Jordan?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, so I
So
think that's what it was about.
yeah, so right, all of these campaigns, right, like Oscars So White is meant to raise awareness of kind of the uh, the dysfunction, or some might say the actual function of the system that we're unaware of, that kind of systemically privileges certain types of actors. Again, since this is the U.S., usually white um, actors. Um, Over the fact that like a lot more of the potential creative talent in any given film might be a woman or a person of color or any other minority, right? Um, the Sawyer just put into the chat, and I was about to say the same thing. The pushback on the Danish Girl, which was kind of as an art film that kind of flew under the radar, an art indie film for mainstream audiences, but Eddie Redmayne won for playing a trans woman. Um, you know, he is a cis white male actor, right, who is playing a trans woman. So um, it's raising these campaigns of awareness with the goal of increasing on-screen and behind the camera representation. Okay. Um, so now that we have that under our belts, talk to me a little bit about Kristen Warner's piece here. Did y'all get a chance to actually read through it? It's not super long, and I think it's really interesting because it works through a lot of potential problems with like our current state of representational politics. And it's a couple years old at this point. I know Kristen. She's a colleague of mine at University of Alabama. Um, Her viewpoint has not necessarily changed that much, although she will acknowledge certain things are slightly different now than they were, at least in the industry. But yeah, what about Kristen Warner's piece on plastic representation? First off, I guess, what does she mean by plastic representation?
Well, I took it to mean like the whole idea of taking a white kind of idea or a white established project or something that was already in the dominant culture and switching it, but not really switching it, either by adding people of color or by adding women or changing certain roles and changing names and things like that, while also not changing anything about the story at all and not adding anything new to it, or you know, or introducing people of color behind the scenes to actually write it and produce it.
Right.
While also still trying to pat yourself on the back, being like, oh well, we did this Black cast for this, or we did this all female cast for this, or we put a gay person in the role of this or whatever, but you're not actually representing anything. You're like shallowly changing something in order to appease a certain audience.
Right. It was really just like box checking, like everything as far as like, you know, this isn't the main role or the main character. Like Estes was saying, we're not changing the narrative or making, let's say, an Asian person or a Black person in the forefront. We're just doing this just so no one can say that we didn't have any diversity.
Yeah, you're changing certain aspects of it in order to appease whatever at the moment is the thing that needs to be appeased, right? In order to stop, certain types of consumer backlash or audience backlash and things of that nature. Okay. I see Sawyer put down in here, Disney. Oh, hold on one second, Anthony. I'll get to you. Give me 1 second, okay?
Okay.
Sawyer put down here Disney. I'm curious what you're directly referencing right there, Sawyer, if you have something very particular in mind, because I know that there are probably a certain number of things we could do.
I've got at least 5.
Okay, well, let's do one. What's your big one?
Currently right now is how they treated the actor for Finn.
Okay.
In the new Star Wars movie.
Yep, John Boyega.
Yeah, I was trying to remember his name.
Yeah.
But just how they treated him, especially in the last movie, where they had set up his character to, become something amazing from pretty much nothing, and then they just kind of pushed his character off to the back and to the side and didn't care about it at all. There was also Disney's publicity grab when the Beauty and the Beast was coming out, the live action.
Right.
They're like, we have a gay character, and then it's literally just LeFou gets 5 seconds of dancing with a man at the very end.
Yeah. Gay baiting, right, as it's called.
So performative and obnoxious. And
yeah.
You literally chose the one character who is literally named the Fool.
Right.
Just bad choices all around.
Yeah, I agree. Anthony, go ahead. Sorry to have interrupted you earlier. I just saw that Sawyer had been leaving a couple of messages there.
Oh, no, it's fine. So that's actually one of the major problems that I have about, the film community is that, they will take, really well put movies that they was made in the past, and they would, do a whole social justice flip on them. And I feel like it's a money grab. It's a quick money grab. Because, why not create a whole new story or a universe that will actually have, total representation of that specific group than taking old fan favorites of that story and just switching race, sexual orientation, and all that other stuff. I personally don't like that, because then I think that's kind of lazy. That you're not really trying to put forth the effort. They just doing that in the heat of the moment. It's so many movies out there, and movies and TV shows that people are flipping, the script because what's going on. Where I prefer them to come up with something original if they're going to do that. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, part of the issue, and like Kristen talks about this in the piece, is that like there's no financial incentive for especially giant media corporations to do that, right? The only reason they care about any of this stuff is because that is a potential audience that they're not going to get the money from, right? So you're correct to point out that it's a money grab. I think what you're dealing with, though, is two different systems. You have kind of like the big company that is pushing for that kind of surface level diversity for those reasons, and it's coming into conflict with sometimes genuinely just people who want to create representation in a meaningful way for people who maybe have not seen themselves in their favorite franchise before, right? So part of the Star Wars thing, because I'm going to talk about this meme with y'all in just a second, was like what is great about that is that there have been Black and Latino and Asian Star Wars fans forever, right? Literally since day one. And kind of like seeing themselves on screen is meaningful in some way, right? I mean, when we think about just like how inundated we are with images of people who look and talk and sound like I do, right? A white straight dude. And then to just see basic, simple representation, it is meaningful, okay? And Kristen Warner is not saying that's not the case. What she's saying is that you can't allow yourself to be placated by those overtures being made to you, right? That like you can enjoy that text, or you can, still remain a fan of something, but you have to also think critically about who it is, like Stuart Hall is saying, who it is producing the thing. I see Sawyer just put Black Panther in the chat, right? Have I talked to you all about Audi versus Lexus vehicles in Marvel movies yet? Sorry, I'm doing like 3 classes where all this stuff is bringing over. Okay. So, in Captain America Civil War, right, where they introduce Black Panther, okay, there's a big long chase scene, right, where y'all remember what I'm talking about, where Black Panther like scales down, he's chasing after Winter Soldier, Captain America is also chasing after him, and they go in that tunnel chase scene, right, with all the cars and everything. You know what I'm talking about if you've seen that movie. Okay, so every car in that scene is an Audi, okay, because Marvel had a promotional relationship with Audi for that film, okay? In Black Panther, the very first scene is also a chase scene with a car, right? Like he drops out of the thing, there's a chase scene, there's cars involved. Every car in that scene is a Lexus. Why do you think that is?
I know, like in my in one of my classes, my authors and genres class, we talk about representation as far as like advertisers and sponsors within a film. So like if you're being sponsored by Audi or whatever, you're going to put that scene in a positive light, and if there's something negative or if there's a different change, then you put that on the criminals. Like I know that the sponsors won't allow you, or they don't want you to put their product in a negative light.
Oh, for sure. So in both of these scenes, it's like a positive thing, and it's really subtle. And all of these relationships for like cars and stuff is like them providing you vehicles for this sort of subliminal advertising within the film, so that it cuts back on your budget, right? So you don't have to buy 20 cars that are going to get wrecked or whatever, right? So that's a part of it. But who do you think buys Audi automobiles?
Like upper class.
Okay. Upper middle class and upper class white people. It doesn't mean no Black people own Audis. My neighbor has an Audi. I live downtown, right? Like This is not me saying no black people own Audis, right? Audi markets itself to a particular demographic. Now, Lexus. Who is Lexus primarily marketed to, and who is their primary purchaser within the US?
So, all right. So, I'm, I love cars and stuff. So Lexus is really, so Lexus is owned by Toyota. Lexus is a luxury brand version of Toyota.
For sure.
So Lexus is really primarily targeted towards the middle and upper class.
Okay. So it's a luxury brand from Toyota. It's black people. Right? So these different brands have entered into different negotiation tactics with these companies to have their brands represented within the films, where Audi is a default for like general middle upper class. Lexus very much appeals to African American audiences, and they know that because they've done their market research. So they want their car in Black Panther when it comes out. They want to make sure that their brand is noticeable on screen. And because even if you don't recognize it, if you are African American and you do know this about Lexuses and their status within African American communities, upper and middle class communities, you then also see a subliminal separate aspect of authentic African American representation within this film, which is all about African American representation and Black American representation on screen, right? So Kristen is really saying, let's not fall for this. It's great to see that stuff, but there are all these machinations behind every decision that gets made that we also need to pay attention to, right? If we're looking to actually fundamentally change and see more diverse representations of culture and community on screen, okay? So one of her she has a couple. I think that her Ava DuVernay, yes, the box checking stuff, for sure, JLo, that's what she's talking about there. She talks about the Ava DuVernay Barbie doll, right? Which is, exactly as we've already discussed. It's taking a product originally intended for white people and it's ascribing, right? I mean, not intended for. They want everybody to buy Barbies, but what does the traditional Barbie look like, right? It's blonde, skinny, blue eyes, right? White. But taking literally this like white representation object and pasting an Ava DuVernay skin over it, right? That's what she's saying it is. Like, it's nice that that happens, right? Ava certainly deserves recognition for her work and her contribution as a cultural figure and, a director of some renown and skill, right? But the problem is that it's not an Ava DuVernay doll. It is an Ava DuVernay Barbie, right? Which has its own kind of subsurface meaning attached to it, right? It is a product of a different cultural output than even one that Ava DuVernay might be participating in herself, okay? I want to share this just because this is kind of her other early on big key piece of evidence, right? When she's talking about don't fall for it, okay? So Star Wars comes out and, this comes up all the time. This is part of the project of Oscars So White and all this stuff too. But Hollywood telling us that female leads and minority leads don't sell movies. And then Star Wars is the highest grossing film of all time. And the two leads are, of course, a woman and a black man, okay? So what are the problems with that understanding of representation there? Why does that not necessarily mean what the people who want it to mean that why does it not necessarily mean like this proves that representation sells the picture?
Because it's still under a standard that's not necessarily for the person they're targeting. It's still like, if for the Barbie, for example, it's still a Barbie. It's still white. It's nothing that Black people created. It's nothing specifically for Black people. It's just using what we already know as the standard to target Black people, to just reel them in to just keep buying their product.
And on top of that, even if it were like something that Black people created, let's say they hired a Black director to make Star Wars, right? And they put a Black main character on screen. That still does not mean that it is the Black person and the cultural aspect of that representation that has sold the film,
Right.
because it is still Star Wars, which is the highest grossing franchise of all time worldwide, right? So yes, it can be meaningful, and yes, we might even see representation behind the camera, either writing or on set or whatever else, but it's still not proving what the person who made that meme thinks that it's proving, right? That's not to say that it didn't bring some people into the fold, but as we've seen, it also pissed off enough people, right? Who, you know, went and saw it and gave it the money anyway, but then like they just got pissed off and yelled about it forever, right? So the idea, as Sawyer just said in the chat, is that it would have been successful if it had literally just been Luke Skywalker walking around on screen for 2.5 hours, right? That could have been the entire movie. The second movie might have tanked after that if it was boring and crappy, but that first movie could have just been anything and been the biggest movie of all time, right? So
it kind of goes into like,
yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to put it into words, but it's kind of like, I don't want to put it in this perspective, but you kind of do have to incorporate it, kind of like telling them to shut up, basically. Like here you go, like you got it, you got your piece. Now on to the next. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that goes back to kind of what Sawyer was talking about with like how John Boyega recently talked about the treatment of that character and him as an actor by Disney. I see that Essence is talking about Anthony Mackie in his discussion of Marvel, right? Sawyer's talking about Disney and the remakes, right? It does not solve a central problem of representational politics, which is what ultimately? Like, we might get representation, but what is it not going to be unless we make big changes? What has to change in order for us to get authentic representation?
I would say that the standard, I guess, when she talked about how like there's the authentic, there's the real version of it, and then there's the kind of like white spin on it, which makes it more acceptable and like the more of a normative standard. I guess we would have to kind of change the standard altogether, incorporating the originals, like the soul music, for example, like just having soul music and not a white spin on soul music, or, you know, Black Panther not necessarily having to be a Black version of a white superhero movie. You know what I mean?
Right. And there are ways that they negotiate these in soft changes, right? So the fact that like Black Panther did bring on a lot of African American and Black British and African talent to work on that film does lend it more authenticity than not, right? Like the fact that you have Ryan Coogler in charge of things, the fact that you have people who are working as cultural consultants for different African nations on that film, the fact that you know, you have a Black crew and a Black costume designer and all of that stuff, right? You do have that, but there's still something that is not changing fundamentally that Warner gets at. What is it?
I think it's the fact that it's not originality to it when it comes to looking at different voices and opinions and perspectives. Like she talked about that with the with the Jay-Z music video.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, it's super cool that you have Issa Rae and Gerard Carmichael and I think Lil Rel and Tessa Thompson all in one video, and it's supposed to be like Friends or whatever, and you put Houdini instead of, you know, whatever the original song was, who the artist. I mean, I know the theme song to Friends, of course.
Yeah.
But it's just Black friends, if that makes sense. It's the same narrative structure as Friends with Ross and Rachel and Phoebe and all of them, but they're just Black people. Like, that's it. And
it's like inherently white, you just put a black filter over it.
Exactly. And like, you see that, like, when I was talking about Anthony Mackie, he brought up the fact that, like you said, it was super great that they stuck so closely to looking in depth to African cultures and things like that. And they had a predominantly Black crew and Black cast, but he pointed out that it was only for that specific movie. Like, even after Black Panther that came out in 2018, you had 2 more Avenger films and a Spider-Man film that came out afterwards. And there was not that same kind of representation in front of the camera or behind the camera. So it was specifically because it was Black Panther, if that makes sense. Because Disney, you know, he brought it up, Disney is not known for, you know, diversifying their talent like that. So,
and beyond the talent, who's in charge of Marvel?
Bob Iger, I think his name is.
Well, Bob Iger was like at Disney, but who runs Marvel Studios? It's Kevin Feige, right?
Yes, yeah.
Who runs Star Wars? Who oversees Star Wars? Do we know?
It's not George Lucas anymore.
It's Bob Iger. Oh no, it's that lady. It's that, I forgot her name.
Kennedy.
Yeah.
As in Lucasfilm, right? Who is a white woman. So,
right.
So part of what Warner is talking about is like, it's great, and like you can even get representation behind the camera, but the way that the entire system actually functions, right? From the way that who makes decisions about who gets budgeted for projects, who makes decisions about when and where and to which audiences movies will get released for and produced for and marketed to, right, is still a deeply entrenched white, predominantly male space, right? And in order for us to start to approach anything similar to actual representational politics on screen, you either have to work outside of that system and make your own way, which is something that like Issa Rae did, right? With oh shit, what's her show on HBO? I watch it.
Insecure.
Yes, thank you. Jeez, my brain at like 4:30 in the afternoon is just shut. Okay, so Issa Rae like starts out making YouTube stuff and gets picked up by HBO. She's given a lot of freedom at HBO, right? But the people who are still making decisions about that show and ultimately will make the decision whether it gets canceled or not, whenever that time might come, are still like white people, right? So she's saying like you have to restructure the system entirely, which speaks to so many issues culturally that go beyond just media, right? So like the argument for defunding the police that Black Lives Matter activists and other activists have been making is that reform is okay, and you can get somewhere with some instances of reform, but at the end of the day, the system is so entrenched in the way that it's always worked that just reforming that system is not enough. The whole system has to be completely reconfigured in order for it to be more democratic, more representational, and just, right? And she's talking about that in terms of media, but you can see kind of how this plays out for like Stuart Hall, who's thinking much broader cultural politics, and Kristen Warner is thinking about that as well, even though her essay is very drilled down and kind of succinct. All of these issues are about the systemic problems that we have to change in order to like really get somewhere, right? Y'all see what we're talking about now? What Stuart Hall was talking about, how we start to interpret the world And if we're interpreting the world through these lenses, instead of trying to change who is inputting or like what that representation can mean in a fundamental way, that the system, like we've been talking about kind of every week, still keeps perpetuating itself in some way.
Yeah, it's just like basically not to look at it like surface level, as in like, okay, yeah, they put a black character in it, but just look at it as more like, okay, who's the one, like you said, actually over HBO and actually in those offices? You know, it's great that Issa Rae is a black woman with her own show. That's great, but who are those people who are like actually, you know, under that network or whatever you call it?
Right. Yeah, and like, what are their goals, right? And some of them, she mentions like John Landgraf at FX, right? Who's a white guy who seems honestly like genuinely committed to diversifying whatever it is his network is putting on the air. She mentions stuff like that, but at the end of the day, like, you know, we haven't gotten to the point where that's happening yet. And we have to think about the motives of the people who are not allowing or who even are allowing that to happen in order to understand what it is we're being shown and what the potential is for representation even. So do we feel like we have a pretty good grasp of all of this?
Yes.
Did y'all like the Warner piece okay? Hopefully it was like not as, I mean, maybe a little fun to read. I know fun's like a weird word to use, given that it's slightly pessimistic and also, you know, still is kind of theoretically heavy, but at least it's, you know, talking about stuff, you know, that we all can wrap our heads around. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.